Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And in this one, I will be covering my solo shuffle PvP tier list, which specializations are going to be the most likely to deliver you success on the ladder. If you're looking at grinding some of the cosmetics, some of the incoming mounts, this is going to be a really useful list for you to try and pinpoint what specialization will be the right pick for you, because some specializations are definitely outperforming others, while some might be a bit of a trap to go into and you're going to struggle with. We have a lot of data points now with weeks of the season gone by, as well as a lot of balance tuning changes that have happened, so there has been quite a bit that has shifted. Now on this tier list, I am going to be including the tank specializations because you can utilize them to get the rewards in game. Some of these tank specializations might be a really good idea if you're trying to get the top 0.1% title, which is limited edition. It goes away at the end of the season, which is Crimson Legend. So right now we've got Blood Death Knight as the first specialization. This specialization is going to be really tough to climb the ladder with. Honestly, though, there's not really a lot of competition for it. I see the highest rated player currently 1,600, while a lot of other classes, the top end is like 2,600, 2,700. So you're not competing against those classes, only against the other ones. It might be one of the hardest tank specs to overall climb the ladder. So if you're trying to get just the legend title, some of the transmogs, it's going to be really hard. But if you want to try and go for the rank 1 title, there's really not a lot of competition on this specialization. Frost Death Knight. This specialization does a tremendous amount of burst damage. It's one of the few specs in the game that can do 100,000 DPS, but it's limited outside of this burst window. Due to that restriction, I think it is limited, and also it can get really bad lobbies. And this is something to take into account when you're picking a specialization to try and climb towards some of the top end rewards, is lobby RNG. And if you get a lot of spellcaster lobbies, it's going to be really tough to group those targets together and get the damage out that you need. You also get shredded pretty quickly by some of the best specializations in the game. So I think for those reasons that it's coming in a little bit lower ranked, probably more of a mid tier. You can get really excellent lobbies and have a good streak, but you can also get really bad lobbies and completely flop down the ladder. Unholy Death Knight, despite all of the nerfs in this specialization, it is an absolute monster. It is completely tearing up the ladder. There is a huge amount of representation at the high end of the ladder with this specialization. It does well in pretty much all lobbies. It can run down single target pressure on casters while retaining high survivability. It can still do well in cleave lobbies. It's an absolute monster at the moment. I would definitely have to say that it is an S tier spec when it comes to solo shuffle, but it does look like it has a lot of competition, unlike Frost Death Knight if you're looking more towards that top 0.1% title reward. Havoc Demon Hunter, this is very easy. This is the best spec in the game. Honestly, I should maybe even have a tier above everything. Demon Hunter has no bad lobbies. You should do decently well into any scenario that you're set up for. You have the tools to deal with everything. You have every diminishing return. You have self-sustain. You have mortal wounds. You are just the whole package. This is definitely the spec of the patch at the moment. Even despite the nerfs that it was hit by recently, it is an absolute monster. Vengeance Demon Hunter, similar to Blood Death Knight, probably even harder than Blood Death Knight to climb, because Blood Death Knight can maybe grip people away for a caster, keep them alive long enough that they could win the game for them. You don't really have that as Vengeance, and I've not seen the representation of it on the ladder to really say that this spec is going to be phenomenal, but again, competition will be low if you want to go for that top 0.1% utilizing it. Balance Druid in solo queue, I actually think this specialization is a lot better than it is in ranked 3s. This is most notably because of the pace of dampening. You are pretty fragile, especially when it comes to things like assassination rogues. You can get some bad lobbies, particularly things with shadow priests that can heal and sustain their teammates with things like Vampiric Embrace. Those lobbies can be tough, and I think because of that, it holds it back from going onto an S tier, but I actually think in solo queue it will be an A tier, even despite its representation. I think it's more or less just because Balance Druid is a less popular spec, but I think that it is definitely a top performer. I've seen a lot of other players starting to have success on it now with the cleave damage build with Starfall. I think that it's a really solid spec. Feral Druid, this is a tough one for solo queue. Having played it now myself, I am very inclined to put it on S tier. I do think that you can get bad lobbies and get cleaved down, but you are very flexible and versatile with a lot of crowd control, diminishing returns. Defense is the main point that is holding this spec back. You have moments where you'll be very squishy, especially against assassination rogues, kind of similarly to Balance Druid. So perhaps it's about the same tier. Now you're going to be more represented than Balance Druid. I don't know if that's because Feral is more popular. I'm very, very, very tempted to put this onto S tier. It's like bordering A. And again, if you're on the left side of this tier, it means you are better than the specs towards the right side of it. That's going to be a differentiating marker. Just because you see two icons in the same tier does not mean they're exactly equivalent. I think Feral is better than Balance. Guardian Druid is doing a lot better than a lot of the other specializations. Some players now pushing closer to 2,000 rating, but it definitely will be a struggle if you're looking to get transmogs and stuff like that. If you're utilizing this, really only going to be like a cheese factor to get a rank 1 title is the way that it's looking for Guardian Druid and solo queue. Resto Druid, phenomenal healing specialization, tons of representation at the moment, lots of different build diversity. You can get some bad lobbies, particularly lobbies against Preservation Evokers when there are Feral Druids and Assassination Rogues, because the ability for Preservation Evokers is to dispel their bleeds. You don't have that luxury, you just have to try and heal through it. So you can get bad lobbies. I also think Shadow Priest, surprisingly, Holy Paladin lobbies, when those two classes are in a lobby, can be very tough because Holy Paladins can spam Dispel the Dots, stay ahead of the damage a lot easier than you, but Paladins are susceptible to being swapped to or trained down. I would say that it's close to S, very, very close to S, but I think because of the factor of getting bad lobbies, can hold it back a bit. It's definitely a top tier spec, right? You're going to be able to push really high with this spec. There's a lot of representation. It's really good, but I think that the bad lobbies can definitely hold it back slightly. Devastation Evoker. This is one where I see some players 2,500, the next day they're 1,900. So this is a very volatile spec. Likely, again, very lobby dependent. If you get a lot of lobbies where there's a lot of melee DPS stacked up that you can kite around with your hover and immune to snare, you're probably going to have a good time. But if you fight any casters, it can be tough to keep up with their overall damage and find crowd control that's meaningful and stack enemies for your burst window. Still heavily dependent on one-shotting with Fire Breath, Disintegrate windows during Deep Breath. I think it's very similar to Frost. It's almost kind of like the same spec, but a ranged version of it. I have seen some players now running Death Knight Evoker in 3s and, doing pretty well, getting that grip cleave damage, but in solo queue, when you can't set those lobbies up, I think it's going to be a lot tougher to see consistent success with it. Isn't to say that it's impossible. I would say that you're getting close to impossible when you're like D and below, but obviously there needs to be some differences. Perhaps it's a bit better than Frost, comparable. Preservation Evoker, easily the best healer for solo shuffle still at this point, although it is getting a lot of competition. It feels like you can't really get a bad lobby, and against any lobbies that don't have Purge, your nullifying Shroud is just absolutely crazy. It just gives you 30 seconds at the start of the game where you can't be CC'd, while every other healer has to deal with things like blind or stun, in cap, fear from demon hunters, and they're falling behind while you're just in the back line doing perfectly fine. And you can lob in damage when you need to for massive living flame hits, fire breath hits, deep breath hits to close out the game. Really good healer still. Beast Mastery Hunter, this specialization, it's got a lot of consistent damage. It's pretty fragile. It doesn't bring surprising burst. Honestly, fits where I would imagine BM Hunter is going to fit, but the fact that Freezing Trap can be broken, you're going to focus a lot on just like avoiding damage and doing as much damage as you can in lobbies, trying to find traps when you can. You're probably going to struggle with this. BM Hunter just doesn't have a lot of synergy with a lot of classes. You can get some lobbies and do really well in them, but then other times you're just probably going to get run over. You're really fragile. Kind of tempted to put it in the C for solo queue, to be honest. It's like the low end of B, but I have seen some people succeeding with this, so it's maybe towards the low end. Again, classes that focus on doing damage, especially spread damage, while having high survivability, are going to be performing better than burst classes or CC classes in this game mode, just because it's really tough to set those scenarios up. Similarly here with Survival Hunter, burst-based specialization, you can get some really bad lobbies. Being melee DPS makes you vulnerable to a lot of these classes. If you're an amazing Survival Hunter, I'm sure that you can make it work. I'm really tempted to give it a pretty low ranking for solo queue at the moment. Like I am starting to hover like maybe in the C, close to B, because unlike BM where you can kind of maybe just turtle, sit behind the pillar for a bit, it's a lot harder to do that as survival and still win the match. You've got maybe a bit, it's pretty similar synergy to a lot of other classes. I honestly feel pretty comfortable putting it lower. Beast or Marksmanship Hunter, I think, is a lot better than Beast Mastery. Probably the best hunter spec for solo queue, just because you do 100,000 DPS. Like, you can just absolutely blast somebody out of the match. That amount of surprising damage is a really good way to get ahead in the lobby and just start getting round wins that maybe other specs wouldn't have been able to achieve because they can't hit those burst windows. But again, defensively, I think you are pretty weak. All the hunters are pretty weak, and burst CC is overall going to be more difficult to pull off, but it's, I would say at the moment, the best hunter spec. Arcane Mage does really strong right now. Things that are super underrated about Arcane is that Kleptomania, the ability to just steal a full row of heal over time effects, whether you're fighting a Resto Druid lobby or a Preservation Evoker, spell stealing, Nullifying Shroud, just spell stealing all of their hots. Like, this is a really effective healer against these classes that are so dominant at the moment. It's got a decent level of survivability, although it is focused much more around its mobility. Blast Wave to knock enemies back. The fact that you have multiple schools of magic is definitely assisting in this specialization rise, and it's got similarly the high burst damage of a Marksmanship Hunter. So I'm actually going to be putting Arcane onto the S tier at the moment for solo queue. Again, it's for this type of list, it's a lot better to compare ranged versus ranged, melee versus melee, because the roles are just so distinctly different. It's really tough to say, well, Demon Hunter and Arcane, you're really comparing those two. You can't really even make that comparison because it's such a different role, but it's on that level from the role that it is. Fire Mage, very similar to Survival Hunter. I think it's going to be tough to do well with this specialization. Does not bring the same amount of punch as Arcane. In ranked threes, though, I think it's going to be doing a lot better. But for this, I'd say C, you could probably make it work, get most of the rewards. Unlike a lot of these tank specs, that it's gonna be tough to get the low end rewards. But oddly enough, pretty easy to get maybe the top 0.1%. I'd say it's the worst mage spec. Are we saying it's the worst spec in solo queue? I think it's close to being the worst spec in solo queue as Fire Mage. Frost Mage brings similar damage to Arcane, but you can get really shut down, line of sighted. Its focus is on like dragging a lot of melee DPS behind pillars, finding one shots, trying to stay alive. It doesn't feel as strong as Arcane, even though it's basically performing the same role. So I'm tempted to put it like it's probably one of the B specs that's really close to being A. At the moment, and maybe as we see more of it, the ice lance damage is nice and accessible, but you can get some bad lobbies. Ellie Shamans are really tough for you, can set you back. Curse of Tongues can be very annoying. There's a lot of lobbies that could make it difficult for you. So high B tier, I'd say it's better than Devastation Evoker, better than Beastmaster. That's why it's on the left of the tier. And then Mistweaver Monk. This healer in solo queue, it seems to be struggling. The fist weaving build is definitely a lot more prominent, but because it's not a smart heal like the melee wings of the Holy Paladin, you can't guarantee that when you use your fist weaving, that's going to heal the right target, and that can definitely cost you a game when it heals the target at 80% instead of the target at 20%, which I think does hold it back. You have really good mana in some situations. It's a balance of figuring out when to play the fist weaving build and when to just sit back and heal in the back line. I want to say it's worse than Resto Druid, but it's still probably an A tier healer. Which is why it's going to the right of the Resto Druid. Brewmaster, I cannot believe it, but this spec is actually the highest rated tank. I thought that this spec stood no chance. I think one of the main contributing factors to that is the amount of crowd control it has. So the ability to just CC a target while its DPS finishes the game for it. If you're going to be going after a tank spec, you want to be one of those guys. Brewmaster seems to be the one spec that actually is managing to pull off success here within that role. Windwalker Monk, you do a huge amount of burst damage. I've seen this class just absolutely destroying people. Your defense is much more focused around mobility. Highly suggest you use diffuse magic very early in games as opposed to trying to be greedy and use other cooldowns, then you have nothing left later on. But if you have good awareness to where your port is, kind of preemptive defensive measures, this class can definitely win games. Very similar to the Marksmanship Hunter in terms of burst, but I think having the ability to port away, heal yourself is going to be a lot more suited than a Marksmanship. So I would actually say that it's A tier at the moment. With how much burst damage it can do and better survivability than the burst options that are in the B tier. Holy Paladin, this is a really tough one. There are some healers dedicated to Holy Paladins that are doing great on the ladder, but I think it is probably one of the most struggle healers. The balance between knowing when to play melee wings into Shadow Priest into AF Warlocks, that's when you're going to be the strongest, when you can AoE dispel against Shadow Priest. And honestly, Shadow Priest is very prevalent, so you can get a lot of lobbies where you can win games simply off of melee wings and spam dispelling all of their dots. But you're probably the easiest healer in the game to kill, which is the main thing that holds it back. So for me, I think it's about a B tier. You can get really good lobbies, but you also get really bad ones, similarly to the other options in the B tier. Prop Paladin, you only fight other Prop Paladins. It's really tough to make a comparison. This is the highest rated tank out of all of the tanks, with a lot more representation, likely because you only fight against other Prop Paladins in the healing role. So if you want a completely unique experience, you can go after that. There's a decent amount of competition for this, but it does look pretty hard to get rating. It's probably because your queue times are really long. Rep Paladin, this is again one of the only classes in the game that can do 100,000 burst damage in those windows, but you can get really bad lobbies. When you get 3 ranged DPS, Boomkins, Destros, Arcane Mages, you're probably going 0-6. Melee cleave lobbies can still also be frustrating for you, as you're one of the more squishy melee DPS. So due to your squishiness, the lobby dependency, I think it is more than fair that Rep Paladin actually gets held back a bit in the solo shuffle lobby scenario. Probably one of the best DPS in the B tier due to its hybrid utility, its crowd control immunity removal for its teammates. If you're one of the rets that actually runs Sanctuary and properly uses it, which I don't honestly see a lot, you can definitely carry some situations that other classes can't. Disciplined Priest, really tough spec for me to rank. I'm in between saying this is the worst healer or decently competitive healer. It's probably bordering very close to Holy Paladin at the moment. The main problem with Disc is if you get lobbies with casters, you're just going to run out of mana. You can't keep up with the other healers in those lobbies. But if you get other lobbies that are more focused around burst, you can definitely still do well. Very similar with Holy Priest in my mind. Maybe Holy Priest is slightly better. It's like a really low A. If I'm gonna, I don't think I can feel comfortable putting it up there. I think it's probably better than Holy Paladin and Disc overall, due to its range stun that's undispellable. But again, if you get lobbies that have caster DPS, you're probably running out of mana faster than every other healer, and that's a really big liability. So this is kind of like the tier of has good lobbies, has bad lobbies, coin flip. These ones don't really have bad lobbies, and these ones are just crazy and never have bad lobbies, right? Shadow Priest, this is the maybe the best spec in the game. We've seen it incredibly representative at the moment. If you want to try and get top 0.1% title with this, it's probably a no-go. The competition is really high. If you're just looking for the low-end rewards, you want the transmugs and stuff, Shadow is a really good spec to do it. Tons of utility, tons of damage, tons of survivability. You just got to remember to press it. I don't know what it is about Shadow Priest that just can't press dispersion right now, but yeah, if you can handle that, you're going to be performing on this. Assassination Rogue, offensively crazy specialization, but I do think you can get bad lobbies with Evokers, dispelling your bleeds. That can set you back, but if you're getting lobbies with a lot of druids, you can overwhelm them. Monks, you can overwhelm them. Survivability is lower than a lot of the other rogue specs, which I want to say that this is an S tier spec. It's got a ton of people playing on it and doing really well with it. Is it an S tier in solo queue because you can get these really weird lobbies? I feel like it's not, honestly. It's either really close, right? It's like the high A bordering S. I want to say it's very close. It's very close. I think the survivability on it is probably what is holding it back for me at the moment. You're usually a target. You need to be really ready for that. Outlaw Rogue is doing surprisingly well in this bracket. I see it more and more. Seems to do really well in lobbies with lots of melee DPS where it can cleave and blade flurry and AoE. I've got a few lobbies with it where Outlaw Rogues are doing 50,000 sustained DPS and can be really tough to survive. And it does really well into the casters as well. I think it's actually a very well-rounded specialization, probably closer to where Feral or Windwalker is in terms of overall power and performance. Definitely was underrated moving into the release of the expansion. Obviously, there were some changes that happened as well, but definitely a good spec to go after. Subtlety Rogue, it's a hit or miss. It seems to be a really cheese-based specialization around Shadowy Duel and Smoke Bomb. You're either finding the kill windows during those cooldowns, abusing the one-shot cheese mechanics, or you don't and you fail miserably. That's just what I have seen from Subtlety Rogues in Solo Shuffle. It's a mechanic that you can definitely abuse with coordination, communication, and rank 3s, but when it comes to Solo Shuffle, it can be a lot harder to pull off. Due to that, I think it's probably one of the best B-tier specs, but it's like you have to be absolutely insane at it to pull it off. It's gonna be really tough. You can make it work. There are some high-rated sub-rogues, but it's not as easy. It doesn't play into just the attacking, doing as much pressure as you can, like Outlaw and Assassination, but its survivability is honestly higher with So it's a close mix, probably a high B at the moment for me. Ellie Shaman, this is a class that has good lobbies, bad lobbies. I'd say its bad lobbies are a little bit less bad than the bad lobbies of the B tier classes. So it's probably a low A rather than a high B. If you get caster lobbies, you absolutely dominate. You do tremendous amounts of damage. I'm sure if you're an EU player, you probably say it's S tier. It fits into the meta of just doing damage, avoiding, and staying alive. So maybe it's just EU Ellies are better. Come on, NA Ellies, you gotta let me know in the comments below if that's true or not, for their ability to survive in these melee lobbies. But I feel like it's probably comparative to Boomkin, to say the least, of just staying alive, doing damage. If you can get really good at avoiding double melee DPS and staying alive in those scenarios, you're gonna do really well in solo shuffle. Enhancement Shaman, tough one for me, honestly. This is maybe one of the toughest specs to rank, because sometimes I see it doing really well. The one strength of it is that you are probably personally immortal. You can just heal yourself with Healing Surge. The Healing Surge self-sustain build seems really good. Purge and Windshear, great utility. Bringing Lightning Lasso when you've got casters on your team has actually been some surprisingly good flavor for the specialization. I got a couple lobbies where I was like a Destro enhance, and I was winning those rounds that I didn't expect to, and it was mostly because of Lightning Lasso on these targets. I think it's achievable. You can get some bad lobbies. It's probably a lot less. It's close to Ret, probably, in terms of bad and good. This one's a really tough one for me, honestly, because I think it's got more potential than what is currently being shown, but at this point, probably middle of the pack is a safe place for it. Resto Shaman isn't really enjoying the buffs it got. These Riptide buffs and Healing Stream buffs are absolutely crazy. If you get caster lobbies, you are not losing. I want to say, like, hands down the best caster healer in the game. Your mana is phenomenal. Healing output overall is great, but you can get run down in cleave lobbies, especially if you're fighting Resto Druids in cleave lobbies. So I think because of the lobby thing, it's probably holding it back a bit. I'd say that it's a bit closer to the other healers with that regard. Maybe Mistweaver's a little bit... Again, like, I don't think it's on the Holy Paladin tier, but it's definitely lower than these two. So I think it makes sense. It's towards the left. I'll probably reorganize this so that the melee DPS are next to the melee DPS, so it makes it more clear as to which one is better than the other. That'll be a better way of doing this, so we can all understand what's going on with the specs overall. Affliction Warlock, this spec does a lot of damage, but can get some really bad lobbies. There's a lot of players really climbing to the top of this. I think Snuts right now is like rank 1 on almost every lock spec. So it's definitely achievable. The only thing that I think affects this spec is that if you get a bad lobby or you're not experienced on it, it's going to be tough to climb. You're really relying on your teammates surviving a long time, which can be difficult to assist your teammates with because you just don't have CC like Demo. So for that, I don't want to say that it's an S tier. I want to say it's like probably low A, bordering high B. I'd say your lobbies aren't as bad as a lot of the bad lobbies of the B, which is why it's probably more towards the A. Demonology, again, this is really close to Shadow Priest, right on its heels. Tons of CC, similar to Demon Hunter. You can keep your teams alive in a lot of scenarios. If you're great at the specialization, you're going to tear it up. Lots of damage. Comes from surprising locations that people might be unsuspecting to, and you'll be able to cheese out a lot of kills with the Nether Portal at low ratings with the Pit Lord. Really good spec, even despite the changes to it. Destruction Warlock is doing a lot better than it has previously. I think that this spec is honestly maybe the highest damage overall, or at least very close to Affliction. I think you can do well in cleave lobbies. I think you can do well in caster lobbies, but I don't think you're like Demonology level, mostly due to the limited CC. So you're probably very similar to Affliction or close to its heels of Affliction. Arms Warrior, you can hit really hard crits with this spec. You can one-shot people, but defensively, you're a lot more fragile than a lot of the other classes. If it was a little bit better defensively, I'd say it's A. But at this moment, I'd say it's probably maybe the best B spec in terms of melee DPS that are currently available. But it's definitely getting up there. Fury Warrior, again, this one, I want to say is probably not stupendous anymore. It seems like Fury Warrior is the one that actually felt the nerfs it got, unlike Unholy and Havoc, which I don't even know if you can tell that they got nerfed. But Fury, you definitely feel it. I think likely it's the 5% damage reduction nerf to it. You're probably similarly squishy, but also not keeping your MS up permanently. That was like one thing really keeping Fury in the fight, was this sustained 40% mortal wounds effect if you stay on your target, and you can't really keep that up. Often I'm seeing Fury Warriors falling behind in a lot of the lobbies that I've played in. So I'm pretty hard sold to put this on A tier. I think it's easier to play, obviously one of the easiest specs to play, but performance-wise, is it really up there? You don't really get good or bad lobbies. It's probably just like neutral. You can pretty much make any lobby work as Fury, but its overall performance, I think, is getting lower and lower with every patch. So it's probably close to arms, honestly, if not like right next to each other for me on the B tier. Prot Warrior got a lot of damage nerfs. It's probably going to be tough to succeed on, similarly to the Guardian Druid at the moment. And now let's organize this so that we've got the casters next to the casters and the melee next to the melee in the correct order, so that you can all more easily understand my thought process. And I think that we've got Preservation Evoker, best healer. Havoc Unholy, best melee, with Havoc being better. Shadow Demo Arcane. Resto Druid, Resto Shaman Mistweaver. Asa Feral Outlaw Windwalker. Ailey Boomkin Affliction Destro. Again, Affliction is one that could go up or down. Holy Priest, Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, Arms Warrior, really close to going to A. Fury Warrior, maybe close to going to A. A sub-rogue could really honestly be anywhere if you're really good at the cheese one-shot mechanics. Enhance, B, maybe getting close to A. Ret Paladin, limited lobbies. Frost, limited lobbies. Frost Mage, again, maybe pushing to A, but I struggle to see it at the moment. If MM was better defensively, definitely A. Devastation and BM Hunter. You're probably going to get bad lobbies. BM Hunter, obviously very easy to play, so if you're looking for something that's just kind of like doing damage, trying to kite away and stay alive, you could deliver some wins on it. Survival, I might be underrating pretty hard on this list, I'm going to be real. But I also see a lot of hunters just like rage posting on social media a lot of times about falling over, and every time I see them, it looks really tough to stay alive. So I kind of feel fair putting it down a little bit lower. For Fire Mage, it is actually becoming a lot better of a spec. It's really strong in ranked 3, especially since the recent changes. This might be harsh to be putting it down here on C. It might honestly be a bit harsh. Maybe it's closer to like a low B. So maybe somewhere there. There's some specs. Obviously, the line is gray. Just trying to give you a better understanding of like where the specs are, how things have ranked up, what to take into consideration when you're picking one for depending on what your goals are and what lobbies you're going to succeed or likely fail in. Other than that, this is the list. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Comment down below with your thoughts. What do you think of my opinions here? Does it fall in line closer or further away from what you're thinking at the moment? Again, compare melee to melee, range to ranged, healers to healers, because if you're intermingling the two, it's going to become a mess. But other than that, thank you very much, and I will catch you in the next video.